He does not know his own grandson anymore, doctor. Rachel laced her words with that perfect pitch of manufactured grief, the kind she usually saved for charity galas. The stiff paper covering the examination table crinkled loudly under my weight. The small room smelled heavily of rubbing alcohol, and the cheap citrus air freshener used to mask the scent of nervous sweat. My sweat, apparently. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the worn leather of my wallet pressing against my thigh. "Is this true, Walter?" Dr. Arris asked, tapping his silver pen against a yellow legal pad. I looked at Rachel. My daughter-in-law sat perfectly straight, clutching her designer handbag like a shield against my supposed madness. She stared back at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Grandpa, please do not let them take you," Ethan whispered. My grandson tugged at my jacket sleeve, his small fingers trembling against my arm. That was the only thing in the room that actually hurt. A 68-year-old man can take a lot of insults. After 30 years working as a community credit auditor, tracking missing funds and untangling hidden debts, I had been called every name in the book by desperate people. But seeing a 10-year-old boy dragged into a psychiatric clinic to be used as a weapon against his own grandfather was an entirely new level of cruelty. "I need you to step out into the waiting room, Ethan," the nurse said, her voice soft but firm. "No, I want to stay with Grandpa." I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "Go with the nice lady, buddy. I will be right out. We still need to get that ice cream." Ethan hesitated, looking at his mother. Rachel nodded, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. Once the heavy oak door clicked shut behind the nurse and my grandson, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Let us continue," Dr. Arris said. "Walter, can you tell me what day it is, and the name of the president?" I gave him the date, the year, and the name of the current president. I recited them in the exact level tone I used when reviewing corporate bank statements. "He memorized that," Rachel interrupted, leaning forward so abruptly her chair scraped the floor. "He practiced in the car. But this morning, he called Ethan by my late husband's name. He left the stove on again. He is a danger to himself, doctor." I did not correct her. I did not point out that she had changed the appointment time 3 times this week just to disorient me. I did not mention that I had not cooked on that stove in 4 months. I just let the silence stretch. The doctor watched me over his glasses. "Do you have a response to these concerns, Walter?" "Rachel is very passionate about our family," I said quietly. The woman glared at me, her mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Rachel wanted a fight. She needed me to raise my voice, to act erratic, to prove her point that the old man was losing his grip on reality. "I need the emergency evaluation signed today," Rachel told the doctor, pulling a thick folder from her bag. "I have the forms right here, for his own safety." Dr. Arris sighed, taking the paperwork. He read through her neatly typed list of my supposed cognitive failures, looking back and forth between the weeping mother and the silent grandfather. "I will need you to sign this section right here, as the primary informant, Rachel," the doctor said. My daughter-in-law did not hesitate. She took the pen and wrote her name in sweeping, confident cursive. The scratch of the ballpoint against the paper echoed loud and clear. That signature was the final piece I needed. Rachel had just put her lies on an official medical record. She handed the clipboard back, offering me a look of deep pity. "It is going to be okay, Walter. We will get you the help you need." Rachel picked up her bag and walked out. The click of her heels sounded like a victory march down the linoleum hallway. She was absolutely certain she had won. The woman believed she had just cleared the path to take control of everything. By the end of the week, she would find out exactly what she had signed. The heavy oak doors of Marcus Vance's law office always smelled like lemon polish and expensive coffee. Sitting across from his massive desk the morning after the clinic visit, I watched my oldest friend adjust his reading glasses. Marcus ran his index finger over the copy of the psychiatric evaluation form I had requested from the receptionist on my way out of the medical building. "She actually signed it," Marcus murmured, and his voice was thick with disbelief. The attorney leaned back in his leather chair, making it creak loudly in the quiet room. Rachel put her name right on the primary informant line, documenting every single lie on an official medical record. "Rachel was in a hurry," I replied. My coffee had gone cold, but I took a sip anyway because the bitter taste grounded me. She needed me out of the way immediately. We just need to prove why. Marcus closed the medical file and reached for a thick, leather-bound binder sitting on the corner of his desk. The gold lettering on the spine caught the morning light. It was the preservation trust my late wife had established 10 years ago. A carefully structured financial fortress designed for one specific purpose: protecting Ethan's future education and well-being. Let us review the mechanics, Walter, Marcus said, opening the heavy cover. Pages rustled as he flipped to the administrative section, stopping at a page bearing my wife's familiar, elegant signature. As the sole acting trustee, you have complete discretion over all distributions. Your son and your daughter-in-law are not beneficiaries. They cannot touch the principal. They can only submit reimbursement requests for Ethan's valid expenses. I stared at the pristine pages. My wife and I wanted to ensure our grandson would never have to worry about college or medical care, and neither of us ever imagined those funds would become a target. But if I am declared mentally incompetent, I prompted, already knowing the answer. Exactly. Marcus tapped a specific paragraph near the bottom of page 42. Section 4 triggers the successor trustee clause. Under the trust agreement, I can only be removed as acting trustee if the specific incapacity provisions are satisfied, including the required independent medical determinations outlined in the trust instrument. Until those conditions are met, I remain the sole acting trustee, and Daniel has no authority to act. My jaw tightened. Daniel was a good man, but he avoided conflict at all costs. If my son took control of the trust, Rachel would control Daniel. The woman would have unfettered access to the accounts within 24 hours. She would drain Ethan's future to fund her present lifestyle. That explained the method, but it did not explain the desperate timing. Rachel had been chipping away at my authority for months, leaving misplaced keys around the house and quietly changing my appointments. But dragging me to an emergency psychiatric evaluation with my grandson in the room was a massive, reckless escalation. Something had forced her hand. Marcus opened a manila folder resting beneath the trust binder. I did a quiet background check on her interior design business, just like you asked last week. You were right to be suspicious about her sudden need for cash. The lawyer slid a printed document across the polished wood, and I noticed a bright red stamp across the top right corner immediately. It was a formal notice from a commercial lender. Rachel is defaulting on a massive business loan, Marcus explained, his tone completely flat. Her boutique is failing. The bank issued a formal notice of default 2 days ago. She has exactly 1 week to cure the debt, or they seize her business assets and freeze her personal accounts. A 1-week cure deadline. That is why she panicked. Picking up the lender notice, I felt the weight of her deceit in my hands. My daughter-in-law was drowning in debt. She did not look at me and see a grandfather. Instead, she saw a vault standing between her and a financial bailout. If Daniel became trustee today, I said, tracing the edge of the paper, she would convince him to approve a massive emergency distribution, probably claiming it was for an educational investment or a secure property for Ethan. And the money would go straight to her commercial lender, Marcus finished, nodding slowly. The attorney folded his hands on the desk. It is textbook financial exploitation, Walter. But we need to look at what she has already taken. You mentioned she has been submitting an unusual amount of reimbursement requests lately. Reaching into my briefcase, I pulled out a stack of printed invoices. Over the past 3 months, Rachel had requested nearly $30,000 for Ethan's supposed needs: specialized behavioral therapy, advanced tutoring programs, and expensive athletic equipment. As the trustee, I had approved the transfers in good faith, trusting the mother of my grandchild to handle his daily care. We need a full forensic accounting review, I told him, placing the stack in front of Marcus. Every single dollar she requested this year. I want metadata, routing numbers, and provider confirmations. Hire whoever you need. I have a forensic accountant on retainer, and we can start immediately. Marcus picked up the top invoice, adjusting his glasses again to read the fine print. This one is for a pediatric behavioral clinic across town. Crisp white paper, a generic blue logo in the corner, perfectly itemized charges. 2 sessions a week for the last month. Nearly $4,000. Ethan has never mentioned going to a clinic, I noted, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The boy told me everything about his week when we got ice cream on Sundays. Marcus leaned closer to the document, his brow furrowing as he studied the margins. The lawyer turned the paper toward the window, letting the natural light hit the ink. Walter, look at the phone number listed under the clinic address, Marcus said, his voice suddenly sharp. Read it aloud. Leaning in, I read the 10 digits printed neatly at the top of the letterhead. My breath caught in my throat. I did not need to look up the number. My wife and I used to dial it every year for our anniversary. It was the direct line to a luxury floral boutique downtown, not a medical clinic. The very first thread of Rachel's elaborate scam had just snapped. My son looked completely hollowed out. Daniel sat heavily in the wicker chair on my front porch, rubbing the back of his neck while ice melted in his sweet tea. Rain drummed steadily against the wooden awning, a dull, relentless rhythm that matched the heavy silence stretching between us. Inside the house, visible through the screen door, Ethan sat entirely still on the living room rug. The boy was simply running his hand over my golden retriever's fur, staring blankly at the floorboards. He had not said a single word since Daniel dropped him off an hour ago. Normally, our Wednesday evening dinners echoed with the sounds of his racing video games and bright laughter. "Rachel is barely sleeping, Dad," Daniel said, finally breaking the quiet. He would not meet my eyes. "The woman spent the entire morning crying at the kitchen table. She really thinks you are slipping away from us, and she feels completely alone trying to manage your care." My jaw tightened. I kept my hands resting loosely on my knees, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level. "I am sitting right here on my own porch, Daniel. Do I look like a man who needs a caretaker? You know how she gets when she is worried." My son let out a long, ragged breath, staring out at the wet lawn. "She means well. That scene at the clinic was just her panic taking over. She truly believes you forgot Ethan's schedule last week, and she is terrified you might get hurt." I took a slow sip of my tea. The urge to yell, to lay out every vicious lie his wife had manufactured over the past few months, burned hot in my chest. But anger would only prove her point. If I attacked Rachel directly, Daniel would instinctively protect his wife. The man had spent 12 years smoothing over her dramatic episodes. I needed my son to reach the truth on his own, without my interference. "Since we are talking about schedules," I said softly, reaching into the pocket of my wool cardigan. I pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the glass table. "I found this in my mail yesterday. It is a copy of the invoice Rachel submitted to the trust account for Ethan's behavioral therapy." Daniel frowned, picking up the crisp white sheet. "Therapy? Rachel told me those were specialized tutoring sessions for his math anxiety." "The billing code says otherwise." I watched a deep line of confusion form between his eyebrows. "It claims Ethan attended 2-hour sessions every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the entire month of October." My son pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. His thumb swiped quickly across the screen to open his digital calendar. The pale glow of the display illuminated the tight corners of his mouth. "That cannot be right," he muttered, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He has soccer practice," I finished for him. "And I pick him up from middle school those exact days, every single week. I have never once driven him to a clinic." Daniel shook his head, staring at the calendar screen, then back down at the invoice. The paper trembled slightly in his grip. "Maybe the billing department made a mistake with the dates. I will ask Rachel tonight. There has to be a clerical error. Offices make mistakes all the time." He was trying so incredibly hard to hold on to the illusion of his perfect family. I could see the cracks forming in real time, the desperate rationalization of a husband who was just beginning to realize he slept next to a stranger. He needed just one more push to realize he was defending a ghost. Before Daniel could formulate another excuse for his wife, his phone vibrated violently against the glass tabletop. The caller identification flashed a local hospital number. He answered it quickly, putting the device on speaker out of habit, because his hands were still shaking from holding the fabricated invoice. "Daniel Mercer?" a crisp, professional voice asked through the tiny speaker. "This is Dr. Eris from the psychiatric clinic." I sat forward in my chair, setting my glass down quietly. "Yes, doctor. Is everything all right?" Daniel asked, his tone instantly defensive. "I am calling regarding the emergency evaluation forms your wife submitted yesterday morning," the doctor explained. The audio crackled slightly over the sound of the falling rain. "I have reviewed her written statement regarding your father's memory lapses. The documentation your wife submitted contains inconsistencies that became apparent after our office received the supporting school records. Those discrepancies raise serious clinical concerns, and I am legally required to conduct an independent follow-up evaluation before I can process the forms." Daniel rubbed his temples, closing his eyes. "Did you find something wrong with the records?" "The dates on her statement completely contradict the school logs," Dr. Eris said gently. "Furthermore, given the presence of your son during the initial intake and the extreme emotional distress the boy exhibited, I am legally required to recommend an independent follow-up." "A follow-up? For my father?" "No, Mr. Mercer," the doctor corrected firmly. "A follow-up for Ethan. When the nurse took him to the waiting room on Tuesday, he was highly agitated. During our conversation, Ethan consistently described being promised a reward if he appeared frightened during the evaluation." The silence on the porch became absolute. Even the rain seemed to quiet down, fading into white noise. Daniel stared at the phone, his mouth slightly open, the color draining completely from his face until he looked physically ill. "I strongly suggest we schedule a private consultation. Just you and me, without your wife present," the doctor finished. "I understand. Thank you, doctor," Daniel managed to choke out, ending the call before his hand dropped heavily to the table. My son looked through the screen door into the living room. Ethan was still sitting on the rug, petting the dog, a 10-year-old boy carrying a burden no child should ever have to shoulder. Rachel had not just lied to the medical staff. The woman had coached our grandson to perform a panic attack, using his innocence to build her fraudulent case against my sanity. Daniel looked back at the invoice sitting next to his tea. The tutoring sessions that were actually therapy sessions. The therapy sessions that supposedly happened during soccer practice. The dates that simply did not exist. Without saying a single word to me, my son picked up his phone again. He closed the calendar application. His thumb hovered over the screen for a long, agonizing moment. He was finally ready to look past his wife's manufactured tears and face the reality of what she had done to his child. Daniel tapped the screen, calling the clinic back to schedule the private appointment for Thursday morning. The fluorescent lights in the conference room hummed a low, steady note that made my teeth ache. Early Thursday morning, the polished mahogany table in front of me was already completely covered in bank statements. Marcus stood by the window, staring out at the gray city streets, while David, his forensic accountant, organized the last stack of papers into neat little rows. "The fake floral invoice was just the beginning, Walter," David said, sliding a thick blue folder toward me. The accountant tapped a manicured finger against a printed spreadsheet, his expression deadly serious. Once we knew she was altering existing letterheads, we pulled the routing numbers for every single reimbursement the trust paid out over the last 6 months. I opened the folder, feeling the heavy cardstock brush against my thumb. The first page displayed a formal request for a private math tutoring program at Oak Ridge Academy, Ethan's middle school. Rachel had claimed the boy was falling behind and needed specialized instruction every Wednesday evening. "I called the bursar at Oak Ridge yesterday morning," Marcus added, turning away from the rain-streaked window. The lawyer crossed his arms, leaning against the sill. "They do not offer private evening tutoring. They never have. And they certainly did not issue an invoice for $6,000. My eyes traced the columns of numbers, trying to steady my breathing. So where did the money actually go? David pulled a secondary document from the pile and placed it directly over the fake school invoice. It was a digital tracing log, filled with technical formatting I barely understood, but the highlighted yellow box at the bottom was perfectly clear. The routing numbers on our submitted invoices did not belong to the school, and they did not belong to the behavioral clinic, the accountant explained patiently. Every single dollar you authorized was funneled directly into a holding account at a local credit union. From there, the funds were transferred straight into the commercial account for her interior design business. A sickening wave of clarity washed over me. Rachel had not just stolen the money. My daughter-in-law had systematically weaponized my grandson's imaginary struggles to cover her failing boutique. She invented math anxiety and behavioral issues, creating a fake paper trail of a troubled child, all to appease her commercial lender. "There is something else you need to see," David continued, sensing my quiet fury. "When someone creates a fake document and saves it as a digital file, the software leaves a footprint. We call it metadata. It records exactly who created the file and when the document was last modified." He pointed to the highlighted yellow box. The author of the counterfeit Oak Ridge Academy invoice was listed plainly as Rachel Mercer MacBook. "Look at the timestamp," Marcus said quietly. "The date of creation was a Tuesday night, right around 8 o'clock. That was the exact time I usually sat in my living room, reading bedtime stories to Ethan while he stayed over at my house. Rachel had been upstairs in her pristine home office, forging educational documents to steal from her own son, while I was downstairs tucking that same boy into bed. The sheer audacity of it left a bitter taste in my mouth. I closed the blue folder and pushed it back across the smooth wood, unable to look at the numbers for another second. "Do we have enough to prove fraud?" I asked, looking directly at my attorney. Marcus nodded, walking back to his leather chair. "We have absolute proof of financial fabrication, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The documents originated from her personal computer, and the stolen money landed in her business account. It is an airtight trail. But an airtight trail in a law office did not fix the rot inside my family." I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket, looking down at the formal administrative notices Marcus had already drafted on his desk. "If you sign this, Walter, there is no going back," Marcus warned, his tone remarkably gentle. This order immediately freezes all trust distributions. The bank will flag her business accounts by tomorrow morning, and the compliance review will become a matter of legal record. I am not interested in going back, I replied, picking up the silver pen. The metal felt cold and heavy in my grip. I signed my name with deliberate precision, securing my authority as the sole acting trustee and locking the vault shut. Call them, I instructed, setting the pen down on the polished mahogany. Tell Daniel and Rachel we need a mandatory family meeting regarding the trust administration for tomorrow afternoon. Tell them it is urgent. Tomorrow is Friday, Marcus noted, pulling his desk phone closer. Are you going to confront her today at the clinic follow-up? No, I said, grabbing my car keys. I will let her play her game at the clinic today. Let her celebrate tonight with her friends, thinking she has finally won. I want her completely blind when she walks into this office tomorrow. The sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and lemon floor wax flooded my senses the moment I stepped back into the psychiatric clinic later that morning. Rachel sat 2 chairs away from me in the quiet waiting room, aggressively tapping her manicured thumb against her phone screen. The woman wore a soft gray cashmere sweater, playing the role of the exhausted, devoted caregiver to absolute perfection. Yet beneath that polished costume, her foot bounced with a frantic electric energy. She kept glancing toward the heavy oak door at the end of the hallway, waiting for my son and grandson to emerge. Dr. Aris had insisted on speaking with Daniel and Ethan privately first, and my daughter-in-law had argued fiercely to join them in the exam room. The doctor shut her demand down instantly, citing strict clinical protocol, which left the 2 of us sitting in suffocating silence. I watched her check her phone screen for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The deadline to cure her commercial business loan was drawing closer by the hour, and her financial desperation was starting to fracture her calm facade. Rachel firmly believed today was a formality. She thought we were here simply to collect the final medical paperwork declaring me incompetent, handing the trust keys directly to her husband. The heavy door finally clicked open, and Daniel stepped out into the hallway. His face looked entirely hollowed out, the color of wet ash. Ethan followed closely behind him, clutching a bright red cherry lollipop, looking significantly lighter than he had all week. Walter, Dr. Aris called out, standing in the doorway with his familiar yellow legal pad. We are ready for you now. Daniel, please step back inside with us. Rachel stood up quickly, dropping her phone into her designer handbag. I should come in as well, doctor, to help him understand the process. That will not be necessary, Mrs. Mercer, the doctor replied smoothly, offering a polite but immovable smile. A nurse will sit with Ethan out here while the 3 of us speak. My son did not look at his wife. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the linoleum floor as I walked past him into the examination room. The space felt much warmer today, without Rachel occupying the corner chair and flooding the air with her manufactured grief. I sat down on the examination table, folding my hands in my lap, while Daniel leaned heavily against the pale blue wall. We need to conduct a standard cognitive assessment, Walter, Dr. Aris explained, pulling a fresh sheet of paper from his desk. I'm going to ask you to perform a few simple tasks. First, please draw a clock face for me, and set the hands to 10 minutes past 11. He handed me a pen and a blank clipboard. I took it, drew a perfect circle, filled in the 12 numbers evenly, and carefully drew the hands pointing to the 10 and the 2. I handed the clipboard back without a word. Excellent, the doctor murmured, checking a box on his pad. Now, I want you to remember 3 words for me. Apple, table, and penny. Can you repeat them? Apple, table, penny, I said, my voice steady and clear. For the next 20 minutes, we moved through the assessment smoothly. I counted backward from 100 by 7s, reciting the descending numbers with the rapid precision of a man who had spent 40 years auditing corporate bank accounts. I identified the day, the month, the year, and the exact street address of the clinic. When he asked me to recall the 3 hidden words at the end of the session, I repeated them without a single second of hesitation. Dr. Aris set his pen down on the desk, interlacing his fingers. He looked at me, and then he turned his attention to my son, leaning against the wall. Your father is entirely competent, Daniel, the doctor stated clearly, his professional tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. His cognitive function is remarkably sharp. He is not experiencing memory loss, dementia, or any form of psychological decline. Daniel closed his eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath that sounded like a dry sob. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, struggling to process the immense weight of the medical confirmation. Then why did Ethan cry on Tuesday? My son asked, his voice cracking on the last word. Why did my boy act so terrified in this exact room? Dr. Aris opened a separate file folder, pulling out the notes from his private conversation with my grandson. Ethan is a very brave boy, but he was carrying a terrible burden. During our private conversation, Ethan described what happened on the drive to the clinic. His description raised concerns about coaching and emotional pressure. His mother spent the entire car ride on Tuesday morning coaching him. She promised to buy him a new gaming console if he pretended to be frightened of his grandfather during the appointment. The quiet room suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. I gripped the edge of the examination table, feeling a surge of protective fury burn hot in my chest. Stealing money was a crime I could handle methodically, but manipulating a 10-year-old child, forcing an innocent boy to participate in the destruction of his own family, was an entirely different kind of evil. There was another detail that stood out in Rachel's written statement, the doctor continued, pointing to a highlighted paragraph on the intake form. Your wife claimed that Walter completely forgot Ethan's name over breakfast last week, calling him by the name of a deceased uncle instead. I asked Ethan about this specific incident. Dr. Aris looked directly at me, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. Ethan found that accusation deeply confusing. He told me his grandfather never calls him by his real name anyway. Because I have never called him Ethan, I replied softly, feeling a sudden tightness in my throat. Since the day he learned to walk and tried to explore my garden, I have only ever called him Scout. Exactly, the doctor nodded, turning back to Daniel. The boy told me Grandpa only knows Scout, so why would his mother say he forgot Ethan? The statement submitted by the primary informant is inconsistent with the information independently provided during the evaluation. From a clinical standpoint, I cannot rely on that allegation. She used generic symptoms of cognitive decline without understanding the actual relationship between your father and your son. My son stared blankly at the medical forms on the desk. The final pillar of his wife's elaborate deception had just collapsed, leaving nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth standing in the rubble. Rachel had orchestrated a massive psychological attack against me, using their child as the primary weapon. Dr. Aris signed the bottom of a crisp white document and handed it across the desk. It was a formal certificate of cognitive competence, fully signed and medically verified. I folded the heavy paper carefully and slid it into the breast pocket of my jacket, right over my heart. When we finally walked out into the waiting room, Rachel immediately stood up. Her eyes were bright with hungry anticipation, completely blind to the devastated posture of her husband. She walked straight toward Daniel and placed a gentle, comforting hand on his arm. Is it done, sweetheart? She asked, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Did you get the paperwork transferring the trust? The roasted scent of Colombian coffee beans usually grounded me, but tonight the dark brew just smelled terribly bitter. My grandfather clock ticked in the hallway, a heavy, rhythmic thud that echoed against the polished hardwood floors of my empty house. I stood by the kitchen sink, letting the scalding ceramic mug warm my stiff hands, and watched the evening rain wash over the driveway. Headlights suddenly swept across the front window, cutting through the darkness. My son stepped out of his sedan, ignoring the freezing downpour completely as he walked toward my porch. Daniel did not bother to knock. He pushed the front door open, walked straight into the kitchen, and dropped a thick stack of printed papers onto the granite island. The young man looked as though he had not slept in a month. His shoulders slumped, his jaw tightened in a painful grimace, and his wet coat dripped quietly onto the floor tiles. You were right about everything, Daniel whispered, his voice cracking on the final syllable. I set my coffee mug down. Take off your wet coat, son. Let me get you a towel. I do not want a towel, Dad, he replied, shaking his head. His hands gripped the edge of the granite counter until his knuckles turned completely white. After we left the clinic today, Rachel went straight to a celebratory lunch with her friends. She left her laptop open on the home office desk. I sat down, logged into our joint credit card portal, and spent the last 4 hours matching her transaction history to the invoices she submitted to your attorney. My son slid the top paper toward me. It was a platinum credit card statement spanning the last 90 days. Look at the dates, Dad, Daniel instructed, tapping a specific row with a trembling finger. On October 14th, Rachel submitted a trust reimbursement request for Ethan's supposed behavioral therapy, $3,200. The trust wired the money into her business checking account 2 days later. I followed his finger down the page, tracing the line across the column, and on October 16th, she made a payment of $3,200 to a luxury resort in Aspen. A girl's trip, Daniel said, letting out a hollow, humorless laugh that barely disguised his devastation. She told me she won a sales contest at her boutique and the vendor paid for the entire weekend. But she paid for it herself. Or rather, She used my son's college fund to pay for her spa treatments and champagne. We stood in the quiet kitchen, the heavy silence broken only by the ticking clock and the rain beating against the glass. Daniel kept pulling more pages from the stack, laying them out like a map of complete betrayal. Every single fake medical bill and fabricated tutoring receipt matched a corresponding luxury purchase. A designer handbag bought on the exact same day she claimed to pay for specialized math software. She had even submitted a forged estimate for a pediatric dental surgery, claiming Ethan needed an emergency procedure. The specific dollar amount she requested covered her annual country club membership dues flawlessly. Rachel had systematically drained the resources meant for a 10-year-old boy just to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. I confronted her when she finally got home, Daniel continued, running a hand through his damp hair. His eyes looked hollow and utterly defeated. She was sitting at her vanity mirror, taking off her expensive jewelry, when I walked into the bedroom. I held up the receipt for the Aspen trip and asked her a very simple question. I asked her if she had anything she needed to tell me about the trust funds. What did she say? I asked quietly, bracing myself for another layer of deception. She doubled down, my son answered, turning his gaze toward the dark window. The betrayal etched deep lines around his mouth, aging him 10 years in a single evening. My wife looked right into my eyes and swore that the trust attorney must have made an accounting error. She claimed you were probably just confused again and mixed up the bank transfers. Rachel actually tried to convince me that the resort charge was a fraudulent transaction. She was currently fighting with the bank. She lied so smoothly, Dad. She did not even blink when she blamed you. The raw pain radiating from him was incredibly difficult to witness. For over a decade, Daniel had built his entire life around making Rachel happy, ignoring her sharp edges and endless demands for a pristine social image. Now, the polished mask had completely shattered, revealing a stranger who was willing to destroy his father and manipulate his son for cash. Daniel finally turned away from the window and looked at me. Tears pooled in his eyes, tracking slowly down his pale cheeks. I am so incredibly sorry, Dad, he wept, stepping forward to wrap his arms around my shoulders. I let her treat you like a burden. I watched her belittle your memory, and I stayed quiet just to keep the peace in my house. I should have protected you, and I completely failed to protect my own son. I hugged him back tightly, resting my chin against his wet shoulder. A fierce, protective warmth replaced the cold anger that had lived in my chest for weeks. You are protecting him right now, Daniel. You looked at the truth, even when it broke your heart. That makes you a good father. He pulled back, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and took a long, steadying breath. What do we do now? She still thinks the psychiatric evaluation gives her the legal right to take over the trust tomorrow morning. Rachel is expecting the bank to release the remaining funds by the end of the week to save her business. She is going to get a massive shock instead, I told him, picking up the credit card statements and sliding them into a neat pile. Marcus and I already authorized a complete forensic audit, and we have frozen every single distribution account. She cannot touch another dime of Ethan's money. Daniel nodded slowly, a hard, unfamiliar resolve settling over his features. When do we tell her? Marcus scheduled a mandatory family meeting at his law office for tomorrow afternoon, I replied, handing the stack of evidence back to my son. Bring these statements. Tomorrow, your wife is going to sit in a room full of lawyers and accountants, and she is going to explain exactly how she spent Ethan's future. The heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open at exactly 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Rachel walked in, wearing a tailored navy suit and a string of understated pearls, looking every bit the responsible matriarch she pretended to be. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood. She carried a thick leather portfolio, undoubtedly filled with the transfer documents her own lawyer had drafted in anticipation of today. Daniel followed a few steps behind his wife. My son looked completely hollow, his eyes fixed firmly on the carpet, but Rachel did not seem to notice his silence. She pulled out a high-backed leather chair, sat down across from Marcus, and offered me a look of deep, manufactured sorrow. Walter, you do not have to be here for this, she said gently, folding her hands on the mahogany table. We want to make this transition as peaceful as possible for you. I kept my hands resting on the armrests of my chair, feeling the cool leather under my palms. I think it is very important that I attend my own trust meeting, Rachel. Marcus cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he opened a thick manila folder. Let us get straight to the business at hand. We are here to discuss the administrative control of the Family Education Trust. Of course. Rachel unzipped her portfolio, her movements smooth and practiced. I brought the medical intake forms from the clinic. Given Walter's rapid decline, Daniel needs to assume the role of successor trustee immediately. The bank requires the signed transfer by 5 o'clock today. The attorney did not look at the paper she pushed across the table. Instead, Marcus pulled a crisp white document with a hospital letterhead from his own folder. He turned it around, sliding it directly in front of my daughter-in-law. "That will not be happening, Mrs. Mercer," Marcus stated, his voice completely devoid of warmth. "This is a formal certificate of cognitive competence. Dr. Aris signed it yesterday afternoon after conducting a thorough, independent evaluation. Walter is fully capable of managing his own affairs, and he remains the sole acting trustee." The confident smile vanished from her face. Rachel stared at the signature at the bottom of the page, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in confusion. She looked at her husband, expecting him to jump to her defense, but Daniel simply kept staring at his own hands. "This is a mistake," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. The woman tapped her polished fingernail against the medical certificate. "He fooled the doctor. He memorized the test answers. Daniel, tell them what happened at breakfast last week." My son slowly lifted his head. The bags under his eyes were dark purple, a stark contrast to his pale skin. "You mean the morning he supposedly called Ethan by the wrong name?" "Yes," Rachel agreed quickly, leaning toward him. "He was entirely disoriented." "Dad calls him Scout," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed loudly in the quiet room. "He has called him Scout since the boy was a toddler. You would know that if you actually paid attention to them." Rachel froze. The air in the room seemed to turn brittle. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to spin another convenient lie, but Marcus did not give her the chance. The lawyer reached into a desk drawer and pulled out the thick blue binder containing the forensic audit. "Your false statements at the clinic were just the beginning," Marcus explained, dropping the heavy binder onto the table. The thud made Rachel flinch. "Walter authorized a complete forensic accounting review of every reimbursement request you submitted over the past 6 months." I watched her eyes dart toward the blue cover. The panic was finally setting in, breaking through her carefully constructed facade. "We verified the metadata on the invoices," I told her quietly. "We tracked the routing numbers. The money did not go to Oak Ridge Academy, and it did not go to a pediatric therapy clinic. Every single dollar went straight into your commercial business account." "That is absurd," she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. Her breathing turned shallow and fast. "Those were valid educational expenses. If there was a routing error, it was a clerical mistake at the bank. You cannot prove anything." That was the crucial moment. She still thought she could talk her way out of a paper trail, completely unaware of what her husband had brought to the meeting. Daniel reached into his suit jacket. He pulled out the folded credit card statements we had reviewed in my kitchen the night before, placing them on the table right next to the forensic audit. "I spent all night matching your trust requests to our joint credit card portal," my son said, his voice hardening with a cold, unfamiliar resolve. "October 14th, you requested $3,200 for Ethan's behavioral therapy. October 16th, you paid exactly $3,200 to a luxury resort in Aspen. You stole from your own son to pay for a spa weekend." The silence that followed was absolute. Rachel stared at the printed statements, her mouth opening and closing silently. The woman who always had an excuse, who always found a way to twist reality to fit her narrative, finally ran out of words. She was completely trapped by her own documents, defeated by the very paperwork she thought would make her rich. "You needed a massive influx of cash by the end of this week to save your failing boutique," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You tried to commit me to a psychiatric ward to get it. You used my grandson as a prop in your scheme, forcing a 10-year-old boy to lie for you." Rachel pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. "I am leaving. You have absolutely no right to speak to me this way." "You can leave, but the money stays completely frozen," Marcus told her, closing his folder with a sharp snap. "Walter has officially halted all trust distributions. Furthermore, my office filed a formal civil claim against you at the courthouse this morning for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The bank has already been notified of the pending litigation." She stopped with her hand on the brass doorknob. The realization of what that meant washed over her face, draining away the last remnants of her pride. A civil claim meant a public record. The bank would immediately freeze her business accounts, and the commercial lender would call in her massive loan by Monday morning. She had walked into the law office expecting to take control of a fortune, and she was walking out with absolutely nothing. "Daniel," she pleaded, her voice trembling as she looked at her husband. My son did not get up. He did not offer her a comforting smile. He He just turned his face toward the window and watched the gray clouds rolling in over the city skyline. Rachel opened the heavy door and slipped out into the hallway alone. The battle was over, but the wreckage she left behind was going to take a very long time to clean up. Civil litigation was just the first step in a painful, necessary process of rebuilding our family. The telephone rang a few minutes past 9 on Monday morning, breaking the quiet routine of my kitchen. Outside, the early autumn sun cast long shadows across the front lawn, a perfectly peaceful start to the week that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing downtown. I set my coffee mug on the counter and picked up the receiver. "The civil claim is officially filed with the county clerk," Marcus announced, his voice crisp and entirely strictly business. A process server just handed the paperwork to Rachel at her boutique. Additionally, we notified the credit union and her commercial lender about the fraudulent transfers. I watched a pair of robins hop across the dew-soaked grass. "How long until the bank reacts?" "They already did," the attorney replied, the sound of rustling paper echoing through the line. "When a commercial lender receives documented proof of wire fraud and a pending civil lawsuit, they do not wait around. They executed the default clause on her business loan this morning. Her accounts are frozen tight, Walter." The legal machinery had engaged, moving with cold, mechanical efficiency. There was no screaming, no dramatic arguments, and no room for Rachel to manipulate the narrative. The consequences of her greed were simply arriving in manila envelopes and automated bank notices. Daniel walked into the kitchen just as I ended the call. My son had packed a small suitcase on Friday night, leaving the colonial house he shared with his wife, and moved into my spare bedroom. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt, his shoulders slumped under an invisible, crushing weight. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands trembling slightly as the dark liquid splashed over the rim. "Her boutique is closed," Daniel said, staring blankly at the dark puddle on the counter. "A friend of mine works in the same commercial plaza. He sent me a text message an hour ago. The property manager arrived with a locksmith and padlocked the glass doors. Her lender seized the inventory to cover the bad debt." I grabbed a paper towel and wiped up the spilled coffee. "Has she tried to contact you?" 12 voicemails since yesterday," my son answered, dropping his phone onto the granite island. The device sat there like a live grenade. "She is panicking. The country club suspended her membership after the civil filing became public record. Her friends are not returning her calls." The woman spent a decade cultivating this image of absolute perfection, and it completely evaporated over a single weekend. Rachel was entirely isolated. The grand social circle she had funded with stolen trust money evaporated the moment the cash flow stopped. She was sitting alone in a massive, quiet house, surrounded by luxury items she could no longer afford, facing a mountain of legal consequences. That was supposed to be the end of the financial damage. We had locked the vault, stopped the bleeding, and initiated the recovery process. But when dealing with someone desperate enough to weaponize a psychiatric evaluation, the bottom is always much deeper than you initially expect. On Thursday afternoon, Marcus asked me to return to his law office. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the forensic accountant was already sitting at the mahogany table. David looked incredibly grim, surrounded by a new mountain of banking documents that had not been there on Friday. "I kept digging into her business records after we filed the civil suit," David explained, gesturing to a thick stack of printed emails. "We knew Rachel faked the invoices to steal the initial $30,000. But her commercial loan was massive. The boutique was severely underwater, and $30,000 was barely enough to cover a month of operating expenses. She needed a permanent bailout." Marcus leaned forward, interlacing his fingers on the desk. "Walter, did you ever sign a collateral pledge agreement for the education trust?" "Absolutely not," I stated firmly, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "The trust principal can never be leveraged or used as collateral. My wife designed it specifically to prevent that." David slid a heavy, notarized document across the table. It was a formal loan modification agreement from a secondary lending institution. I scanned the dense legal text, my eyes jumping to the bottom of the second page. Right there, on the guarantor line, was my signature. Or rather, a nearly flawless forgery of my signature. Rachel tried to pledge the entire trust principal as collateral to secure a massive line of credit for her business, the accountant revealed, his voice perfectly steady despite the explosive nature of the news. She used the forged documents to prove she had institutional backing. The only reason the loan did not fund is because the secondary lender sent a verification request to the trust account, and I intercepted it during the audit. The sheer scale of the deception took my breath away. Faking medical bills was a terrible breach of trust. Forging a signature to pledge hundreds of thousands of dollars in protected assets crossed a massive, dangerous line. "This is no longer just a civil matter regarding stolen funds," Marcus said softly, picking up the forged pledge document. "We are looking at federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and attempted bank fraud." Rachel did not just try to steal from Ethan. She tried to leverage his entire future to save a failing furniture store. I looked out the window at the busy downtown traffic, feeling a profound sadness for my son. Daniel thought the fake invoices were the worst of it. He had no idea his wife was operating a criminal enterprise from her home office. "Package all of it," I instructed, turning back to the attorney. "Every fake invoice, the metadata, the routing numbers, and this forged collateral pledge. Send the entire file to the district attorney." Marcus nodded slowly, pulling a blank folder from his drawer. "A criminal referral. We'll take this completely out of our hands, Walter. Once the prosecutors see this level of premeditated fraud, they will not let it go. She is looking at serious prison time." "Package it," I repeated, my voice leaving no room for debate. Nobody is allowed to leverage my grandson's future, not even his mother. The following months moved with agonizing slowness. Autumn leaves gave way to freezing winter frost. Daniel officially filed for legal separation, moving his belongings into a small apartment across town. Ethan began seeing a real child psychologist, slowly unlearning the manipulative tactics his mother had forced upon him. We spent our Sundays playing board games by the fireplace, slowly rebuilding the quiet, steady trust that Rachel had tried so hard to destroy. We heard nothing from the legal system for nearly 5 months. The silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket over the family. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late February, my phone rang again. Marcus was on the line, and the background noise of his busy office was completely absent. "Walter," the lawyer said, his voice carrying the distinct weight of finality. "The district attorney just called my office. They have finished reviewing the forensic audit. They are offering a plea agreement," Marcus continued, his voice tight with professional satisfaction over the phone. "The federal prosecutors do not want to put a 10-year-old boy on the witness stand, and frankly, neither do we. With the forged collateral pledge and the fabricated medical invoices, they have her completely cornered. She knows she cannot win a trial." I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter, watching the morning frost melt on the window pane. "What are the terms of the deal?" 5 years of supervised probation, mandatory psychological counseling, and full restitution to the education trust, the attorney replied, the rustle of heavy paper echoing through the receiver. "If she violates any condition or misses a single monthly payment, she goes straight to a federal facility for wire fraud. She signs the papers tomorrow morning in front of the judge." The county courthouse smelled like industrial floor wax and old dusty leather. I sat in the back row of the gallery the next day, resting my hands on the cold wooden bench ahead of me. Rachel stood at the defense table, completely stripped of her usual country club armor. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, simple knot, and her expensive designer suit had been replaced by a plain gray blazer. The woman looked incredibly small, entirely diminished by the heavy oak podium and the vastness of the courtroom. "How do you plead to the charges presented?" the judge asked, his voice booming over the microphone and bouncing off the high ceilings. "Guilty, Your Honor," she whispered. The judge struck his wooden gavel. The sharp, decisive crack sealed her fate, binding her to a strict schedule of restitution payments that would garnish her wages for the next decade. There was no screaming, no dramatic apology in the middle of the room, and no sudden realization of her moral failures. Justice did not arrive with a cinematic spectacle. It arrived in the form of cold, binding paperwork and a permanent criminal record. My son sat right next to me on the hard bench, but Daniel did not look at his wife as the bailiff escorted her toward the clerk's office for processing. He held a thick manila envelope on his lap, keeping his hands perfectly steady. Inside were the finalized divorce filings. My son planned to submit them to the family court clerk down the hall on our way out of the building. "Ethan had a really good session with his therapist yesterday," Daniel said quietly, staring straight ahead at the empty wooden bench where the judge had been sitting. "The doctor taught him how to recognize when an adult is asking him to carry a secret that feels wrong. My boy actually smiled when I tucked him into bed last night. He is a resilient kid," I told him, placing a hand firmly on his shoulder. "And he has a father who chose to protect him when it mattered most. That makes all the difference in the world." Daniel nodded, taking a deep breath before standing up. He carried his envelope down the center aisle, walking with a new, quiet strength. He was finally stepping out from under the shadow of a person who had nearly consumed him, ready to dismantle the final piece of his broken marriage. Later that afternoon, I returned to the law office. The winter clouds had cleared, leaving the downtown streets bright and clean under the afternoon sun. Marcus had a single document waiting for me on his polished mahogany desk, resting right beside his silver pen. "This is the amendment to the trust instrument," the attorney explained, tapping the top page. "As the sole acting trustee, you have the full authority to appoint a corporate co-trustee. This means a designated financial institution will manage the daily investments and oversee the disbursements alongside you." I looked down at the crisp white paper. The past few months had taught me a terrifying lesson about the extreme vulnerabilities of family wealth. If my health ever genuinely failed, or if I passed away unexpectedly, Daniel would have been left entirely alone to guard the vault. Even without his wife in the picture, managing millions of dollars was a massive, dangerous burden to place on a grieving son. "This ensures Ethan's future is never dependent on family politics again," I noted, pressing the tip of the pen to the signature line. "Exactly," Marcus agreed, taking the signed paper and slipping it into a secure file cabinet. "The corporate trustee requires multiple layers of institutional verification for any medical or educational withdrawal. Nobody will ever be able to forge a clinic invoice or pledge this money as collateral for a private loan again. The fortress is completely locked down, Walter." I walked out of the law office feeling genuinely light for the first time since that terrible afternoon at the psychiatric clinic. The cold wind stung my cheeks, but my chest felt incredibly warm and settled. I had not sought this conflict to ruin my daughter-in-law. I had simply stepped out of her way, allowing the sheer weight of her own deception to pull her down into the dirt. The trust money was safe. My son was finally free from a decade of manipulation. Most importantly, my grandson was learning how to be a normal child again, surrounded by people who loved him for exactly who he was, not for the bank accounts tied to his name. The storm had finally passed, leaving the ground ready for our family to heal and grow. 1 entire year later. You spend your entire life building a solid foundation, hoping it will be strong enough to hold the people you love when the storms eventually arrive. 1 year after Rachel walked out of that federal courtroom, the foundation of our family finally felt secure again. Ethan spent this past July at a summer science program, building model rockets and coming home with dirt on his knees, completely free from the heavy, anxious shadow his mother had once cast over his childhood. Daniel stood on my front porch yesterday afternoon, watching his son chase a plastic rocket across the green lawn. My son finally turned to me with a genuine, unburdened smile. He thanked me for stepping in, for bearing the weight of those terrible accusations so he could finally see the truth about his marriage. I looked at my son, and then at my grandson running across the grass, and told him the only thing that truly mattered. It was never my money. It was always his future. But when you look at everything that happened, you have to realize the very real danger hiding in plain sight within so many normal homes. You might think that family ties are enough to guarantee absolute loyalty, but financial greed wears incredibly convincing masks. Sometimes, it wears the mask of a deeply concerned mother or a devoted caregiver. You have to understand that true protection is not just about keeping money safely in a bank account. It is about establishing ironclad legal boundaries that remove the temptation entirely. If you are stepping into your golden years, you must secure your assets with strict, independent oversight, just like a corporate trustee, so your hard-earned legacy never becomes a toxic battleground for your relatives. You do not lose your competence, your dignity, your voice, or your legal rights just because your hair turns gray, or because you choose to avoid unnecessary arguments in the living room. You also have to actively recognize the warning signs of elder financial exploitation before it destroys the people you cherish most. When someone attempts to isolate you from your trusted advisors, when they suddenly start questioning your memory over minor misplaced items, or when they use your profound love for your grandchildren as emotional leverage, you are being manipulated. You cannot fight these battles with screaming matches or tearful pleas. You win them with a quiet, methodical gathering of concrete proof. You fight back by letting the manipulator sign their own name to their manufactured lies, stepping aside, and letting the justice system do its exact job. Silence is never weakness when you use it to build an airtight case. Protecting your family sometimes means locking the front door against the very people who already have a key to your house. You have to be willing to see the painful, undeniable truth about the people sitting at your dinner table, especially when an innocent child is caught in the middle of their schemes. Have you ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving legal boundary to protect your loved ones from a deceptive family member? Or found yourself doubting your own reality because someone you trusted was constantly twisting the truth? Tell me exactly how you found the strength to fight back and reclaim your peace in the comments below. Because your survival story might be the exact lifeline someone else desperately needs to hear today.